The funeral of Pope Francis in 2025 was not just a farewell to a beloved religious leader. It was a historic moment filled with symbolism, tradition, modern touches, and heartfelt tributes. The world paused to witness the final journey of a man who reshaped the papacy for the 21st century. From the earliest moments after his passing, the Vatican was transformed into a place of deep mourning and reflection. As soon as news of Pope Francis' death was officially announced, the great bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled, echoing across the rooftops of Rome. Pilgrims, tourists, and locals gathered in St. Peter's Square, many of them holding candles, rosaries, or photos of the Pope. An immediate atmosphere of prayer and remembrance spread through the city, but unlike past papal deaths, there was a profound focus on simplicity, in line with Francis' lifelong call for humility and care for the poor. The Vatican announced that the funeral arrangements had been personally discussed and approved by Pope Francis himself before his death. He had requested a ceremony that was dignified yet simple, reflecting his vision of a poor church for the poor. Unlike previous funerals, Francis requested a wooden coffin without elaborate ornamentation, crafted from sustainable materials. His burial garments were simple white vestments, without the traditional red shoes often worn by popes. One of the most remarkable aspects of the funeral was its inclusivity. Invitations were extended not only to Catholic cardinals, bishops, and priests but also to religious leaders from Protestant, Orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, and other traditions. Representatives of indigenous communities, migrants, and refugees, groups Pope Francis had consistently championed, were given prominent places at the funeral, symbolizing his lifelong commitment to dialogue and solidarity. The Mass was presided over by Pope Francis' successor, whose election earlier that year had marked another historic moment for the Catholic Church. Breaking with centuries-old customs, the successor delivered a heartfelt homily not just as a pope but as a personal friend and student of Francis. The sermon was filled with anecdotes about Francis' compassion, humor, and tireless pursuit of justice. It was less a formal eulogy and more a tribute from a grateful disciple to his mentor. The funeral mass was held outdoors in St. Peter's Square, under the same ancient colonnades where millions had once gathered. The universality of Francis' vision. Following the mass, the procession toward the grottos under St. Peter's Basilica began. As the coffin was carried, spontaneous applause broke out, a traditional Italian sign of respect and gratitude. The Swiss Guard, usually known for their colorful uniforms and stiff posture, were seen visibly moved, some wiping away tears. In another break from tradition, Pope Francis had chosen not to be buried in an elaborate sarcophagus but rather in a simple tomb near that of St. Peter, echoing his desire to remain close to the heart of the Church's origins. On the tombstone he had requested only his papal name, the dates of his life, and the words Servus Pauperum, servant of the poor. Throughout Rome, giant screens were set up for the public to follow the proceedings. In Buenos Aires, his birthplace, crowds gathered in cathedrals, public squares, and even stadiums to celebrate masses in his honor. In slums, prisons, refugee camps, and rural missions worldwide, countless memorial masses were held, fulfilling Francis' dream that the margins of the world would not be forgotten. The digital world also paid its tribute. Social media platforms were flooded with images, quotes, and personal stories of encounters with Pope Francis. Hashtags like #GraciasFrancisco and #ServantOfThePoor trended globally. Millions watched the funeral via livestream, making it one of the most watched religious events in history. Among the most touching moments of the funeral was the offering of gifts during the Massachusetts. Instead of symbolic gifts of power or wealth, the gifts brought to the altar included a battered refugee life jacket, a simple wooden cross from the Amazon, a worn copy of Laudato Si, and a loaf of bread baked by a homeless shelter. Each gift spoke volumes about the causes and people closest to Pope Francis' heart. Pope Francis' funeral also left a powerful political message without uttering a single political word. Leaders from nations that had once clashed found themselves side by side in mourning, a testament to Francis' tireless diplomacy, bridge building, and calls for peace. As the camera panned across the gathered leaders, there was a palpable sense that the world was not just mourning a pope but a global moral leader. Even in death, Francis had one final gesture planned. Before the conclusion of the funeral mass, a letter he had written months before his death was read aloud. It was a simple but powerful message of gratitude, hope, and an urging to continue the work of caring for the poor, the planet, and the marginalized. His final written words, "Pray for me," were met with tears from the crowd. The funeral of Pope Francis was not just the end of a papacy. It was the sealing of a legacy. His emphasis on mercy, inclusion, humility, and justice was reflected in every detail of the ceremony. It was a moment of global unity, a snapshot of a church striving to be less about power and more about love. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, a deep silence fell over the Vatican. There were no grand fanfares, no shouts of triumph. Only the sound of soft prayers and the rustle of thousands of white flowers in the breeze. In that quiet moment, the world said goodbye not only to a pope but to a friend of the forgotten, a champion of the downtrodden, and a humble servant of God. The bells of St. Peter's rang once again, not in mourning now but in thanksgiving, a final gentle farewell to Pope Francis, the servant of the poor.